Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Historia Canadiana, the show where we talk about Canadian history, culture, and sometimes, like today, do some author interviews. Today, we're going to be talking with Ryan Uytdewilligen. Damn it, I practiced before starting, and I still butchered it.
No, you got it compared to most people that attempted first try. So.
All right. So today we're going to be talking with Ryan about one of his latest books, The History of Lethbridge. He was actually born in Lethbridge, Alberta, and raised on the family farm there outside of the town of Coaldale. And he studied communications arts with a major in broadcast journalism at Lethbridge College. Ryan has actually published a great deal of books and, nonfiction, fiction, from Hollywood history to children's books. And his 2019 book, Aquila, was actually nominated for a Pushcart Prize, which is very impressive. And like we were saying, today we're here to talk about his 2020 release, The History of Lethbridge. So welcome to the show, Ryan.
Thank you so very much for having me. Really excited to talk about some Canadian history, specifically Lethbridge.
Absolutely. I have to say, before we actually get into this book, I do find it very impressive that you've managed to touch upon so many subjects. Like, listeners might not be aware, but I'll link your website in the description. But your most recent book is about possibly one of the worst movies ever made with John Wayne's The Conqueror. But as you were saying, you've also published children's books. So it's very interesting that you've managed to be so versatile in your writing. Well,
the through line for me, I guess, would be film and movies. I'm a huge film history buff. And so I've done books about coming of age movies, kind of geared to teenagers. I've lately done the John Wayne book, which, a lot of seniors have really jumped on and enjoyed. And now I'm focusing, actually the book that I have in development right now is a book to introduce classic film to kids. So that's sort of where my heart lies. And so the Lethbridge book is a bit of an outlier as far as subject matter, but it's still something that's very much a part of who I am.
Right. So I guess let's get right into that then. So for people who might not be aware, the title's pretty self-explanatory, I guess, but how would you describe this book for someone who's just going right into it? What makes it distinguished? What distinguishes it, I guess, from other history books? What were you going into this with? In mind?
So the History of Lethbridge is about the history of Lethbridge.
Wow. Thank you. All right. Interview over. Thank you very much for listening. Yeah.
It's the entire overview of the city, basically. They're really, there's been a lot of books about distinct chapters in the city's history, whether it's what was happening during a world war, a lot of the early history when it wasn't even a community. It was sort of the outlaw Wild West of Canada, and very near to Lethbridge is Fort Macleod, about 50 kilometers away, which is where the RCMP established one of their first and largest bases out west. So it was a very interesting area, but no one had really told the entire history from, the dinosaur period and how the land formed and became, such a unique flat coulee landscape all the way till 2019, basically.
Right.
And so, it takes you through all the, the stages of evolution, the notable people who have shaped the city, and why some of the iconic buildings like the High Level Bridge are standing there in the first place.
Right. Absolutely. So just to kick you off or at least to address you as an author in particular, what got you to writing in the first place? And then we'll kind of delve into your writing of this book in particular.
Of course. Yeah. I always wanted to be a writer ever since I was a little kid. The goal was to open my own bookstore and sell only my books, which I'm not there yet, but soon.
That's why you're
fingers
so
crossed.
productive, is you just want to fill up shelves with.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. I got time against me here. But yeah, I studied journalism and worked in that for a couple of years, and I got a job as a copywriter, and the actual title was called creative writer. And I just thought that is the most heavenly two pairing of words I've ever heard, and it sort of clicked in me right after college that that's what I want to do is be a creative writer and write fiction and nonfiction. I have a lot of love for history and historical fiction. So I studied writing at Vancouver Film School. I've worked in and out of the film and television industry, and I've just been, writing ever since, whether it's articles, a lot of articles about history, nonfiction, short stories, you name it. So right. I'm always busy writing.
Interesting. And the creative part of it, had you even before you went to school in journalism or anything like that, had you actually done your own thing on the side of any kind of creative writing, whether it's poetry or anything like that? Or did that really only come later once you started formally studying it?
When I was a little kid, I would write a lot of stories. I would write like my own Star Wars episodes or Friends episodes.
As one does.
Into, and so it just seemed like, this is what I want to do. But then it just never occurred to me like, this is something that you can do. It's just one of those things like coloring or sports that you do as a kid to pass the time. And then I think I circled back around to it after college and like, yes, no, I with the knowledge that I've learned in journalism, I think maybe I could do something with it. And so I really only took a stab at doing something a little less than 10 years ago. And I've really been doing it full time since 2015. And ever since, that's what I do.
Yeah, that's awesome. Especially that very few people can say, like, who are interested in creative writing or anything, can say that they can do that as a full-time job. And, that's commendable in and of itself, right? So
I appreciate that. Yeah, I've had different, like I've been a newspaper editor and entertainment reporter, and everything just sort of helps, I think, refine your skills, whether you're writing a commercial or an article about the Academy Awards.
Yes. So getting on to the history of Lethbridge itself, when you first reached out to me about this project and stuff like that, I was interested, obviously, since we're doing this interview, but I was kind of surprised. I was like, why Lethbridge of all places? Because Lethbridge is not a place that many people think of, right, in Canadian history or general history.
At all. I mean, I have moved around a lot. I moved to Vancouver from Lethbridge, and I would tell people I'm from Lethbridge, and half the people did not hear of it ever in their lives. And anyone who did generally would say to me, well, I think my aunt's friend lives there. And no one had been there. Very, very few people have. And if they do, it's either passing through or, some people went to go study at the university. And there's a lot of lifers there, people who are born
classic small town,
like my family. They were born there, and the generations continued on. But when I moved, I kind of left, wanting to make my mark as a writer and get into film. And so I left, I don't want to say bitter, but I'm like, okay, I'm done with this chapter of my life. And what happened a couple of years later is I really felt homesick. And I realized by living in different areas that, it is kind of special and unique in its own way. And I wanted to get, reintroduced to my home, essentially. And that's why I wanted to write it, was just for me, honestly, and selfishly, just to, research and maybe, since I wasn't actually physically there, it was a way for me to be present in Lethbridge still and have a connection.
Right. So that's really interesting, because the way that you're telling me about this, there are multiple levels, it seems, to interest in this. So there's obviously, as you were saying, the personal interest, but also there seems to be, and I got the sense of when reading the book, there's this sense that just because it's a small town that no one really thinks about doesn't mean that there isn't anything interesting going on, or that it's not worthy of attention in any sense, right? And it's a testament to the importance of history writing and just narratives as a whole that you wrote this book.
Absolutely. And that's sort of, once I decided to do it and got into it, I realized what I wanted to accomplish with it is that so many people, especially people from Lethbridge, would say, well, Lethbridge doesn't have a history. Or when I
Yeah.
told them I was working on a history book about Lethbridge, I didn't know Lethbridge had a history. And that's such a, like a, every place, every single place, every
Mhm.
community, no matter how big or small, has a history.
Yep.
And I think a lot of these things get overlooked because, our eyes go to the more flashy places like the history of New York, or where
Yep.
I am right now, Toronto. There's a lot more happening culturally, and so
Mhm.
people gravitate to those places. But I think small communities, and people in Lethbridge will even fight me and say, well, Lethbridge isn't small, but it, compared to a lot of bigger centers, it is. But it just has it had its own role in history, whether it was the World Wars or the Great Depression. It had its own perspective that you don't often
Yep.
hear. And I think that's when I started to dig deeper. This is something original and not often told. And I think my hope was for people to understand that and maybe get a little bit of amusement or originality from reading the book.
Absolutely. I'm always reminded of that fact that there's something in everything there, that everything has a history. When I first, so I live I live in Montreal, and my family comes from the Eastern Township, so like small rural community in Quebec. And there's a small village there. I think there's like 200 people in it, called Pigeon Hill. Like, it's the most
Okay.
boring sounding name possible, and even that has a history. And I'm like, well, if Pigeon Hill can have a history book, then anything can. Like, at this point.
Absolutely.
So beyond yourselves, so you were saying you started off more personal, wanting to reconnect with the history of this city that you were from. Did you have any specific audience in mind when you were writing the text? Like, was it for the people of Lethbridge that you were writing this, did you keep them in mind, or was it for a more general audience?
Well, it's been a big, long journey, honestly,
Mhm.
because I at first really wanted to write it for me. And especially, I initially just wanted to focus on the 1960s.
Oh,
That was
interesting.
all I wanted to do. And like, I'm just going to tell what Lethbridge was like in the 60s. So this was about 7 years ago. And I started to do a little bit of research and plan out a book. And then I very quickly realized there is not enough history to constitute a book about Lethbridge in the
Yeah.
1960s.
At best, you had an article on JSTOR or something.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So I expanded it because if you look at the books that I've done, fiction, nonfiction, I gravitate to the history of the baby boomer era. That's sort of if I could choose any time to live, it would be the mid 40s to the mid 70s. And
Interesting.
so I decided, well, I'll tell what Lethbridge was like then. That's when my parents were born, and I've been hearing stories from my grandparents all my life. So that was sort of
Mhm.
a window into it. And so I started to write up a draft. And again, it was a very small book. And eventually I got encouraged by other publishers to tell the full encompassing history. And it was something I never considered because I just figured the story had been told so many different times. But in fact, it was only like little bits and pieces, like a book about the history of the iconic bridge, or a book about Fort Whoop-Up, the
Right.
tourist attraction there. And so it seemed like something original, and I thought that a lot of people from the city especially would get something out of it. So, I knowing the people that I had referred to earlier from across Canada who had never heard of Lethbridge,
Mhm.
I figured, well, I'm not going to write this for them. They're not going to have much interest going in, but I think there's a lot of interest from people from Lethbridge and area who's never gotten the opportunity to actually go and
Mhm.
read their history and be see something that's presented to them from start to not finish but present day.
Right. Interesting. And you said this is really interesting. You said originally you wanted to talk about the 60s. Was there
Yes.
an event in particular that happened in the 60s that like drew your attention to that moment? Or was it purely, like you were saying, just the fact that people around you had talked about about that period.
Well, my parents were born in the early 60s, so it was
Right.
very stuck in my brain. But,
Mhm.
at that time also, it's an attractive decade as far as music and fashion and civil rights, protests. There's a lot going on, especially American
Mhm.
pop culture history, essentially. And I thought maybe that translates to not only Canada, but where I grew up. And it was just curiosity that started to
Right. And
drive me.
for listeners, you don't have to go into details because obviously we encourage listeners to read the book, but did anything similar to that happen in Lethbridge? Any kind of
Very
cultural
little.
revolution?
Probably out of all of the decades that I discuss in the book, it's probably the least talked about
Right.
because, there's a lot to discuss after the Second World War, and especially in the 1950s. But
Mhm.
probably the biggest thing to happen was that the University of Lethbridge officially opened up in 1967 and expanded the city. For those who don't know, it's divided by a river, the Old Man River.
Yep.
So there's the west side and the east side, and so no one had gone to the west side. Basically, there was maybe 30 or 40 homes at that time. So
Mhm.
that was the biggest event. Was they put the university, or announced at least that they were going to put the university there, and then there was a couple protests because people thought that was too far,
Of
too
course.
underdeveloped, and that was the extent of that.
Right. No, but it's interesting because even while you're saying that there very little happened, Lethbridge in this time still kind of demonstrates a lot of the ideas that were happening in many ways. This kind of opening up to wider education that you see
Yes.
in the 60s, right? Or at least a push to invite people to think critically a bit more with the creation of a university, especially right around the centennial era. Right.
Exactly,
So
and that's probably the most significant date in there, or at least one of them is the centennial year, and a lot
mhm.
of reflection seemed to happen throughout all of Canada, and Lethbridge got a lot of arts and a lot of mainstays that are still there now, like a couple of gardens. There's called the Nico Yuko Japanese Garden, which
Mhm.
opened up in 67 for the centennial, and so that was definitely an important year. But beyond that, leading up to that, it wasn't as comparable to other places, maybe, that a lot of more radical changes were happening.
Sure. You mentioned your publishers pushing you
Yeah.
to enable certain changes. So we all like to think that creatively we can just put out whatever we want, or just do as your heart's content to your heart's content. But I'm actually curious, in terms of publishing this book, was it hard to convince publishers to get on board with it?
Oh yeah,
Because
are you ready for this wild tale?
let's
So
go for it.
yeah, so I did write that little baby boomer section that
Mhm.
I talked about, and I sent it to the Historical Society of Lethbridge, and like, would you do anything with this? And they said no. It was really just this very lengthy essay, and so they passed on doing something. So I started sending it out to different publishers, and one who focuses on Canadian history, specifically the history of different cities in Alberta. They thought, well, we haven't done one on Lethbridge. You should write the entire history of Lethbridge. And so that was sort of what pushed me to consider doing that. I didn't want to do it at first, honestly, and then I started to get more feedback from other publishers who are like, "Well, why wouldn't you tell the whole history?" And then,
Yeah.
well, yeah, why wouldn't I? So after deciding going that route, then I signed with that publisher and started doing all the research to flesh it out, tell the whole encompassing story. And by the time it was ready to go, by the time it was edited, all the pictures had been selected, the book had been, essentially laid out. The publisher had some funding issues
Oh
and
no.
did not put it out. They
What a nightmare.
they kind of panicked and worried about recouping losses, and this was just right before the pandemic, essentially. So
Okay.
it could have got even worse for them, but they were kind of just concerned for their future. So they handed the book over to me and said, do with it whatever you want. But essentially, it was ready to be printed. And so I sat on it for a while. I tried to find another publisher and honestly forgot about it until the summer of 2020. And
Mhm.
I thought, I put so much work into this and I want people to read it. I'm very proud of it. So I did it myself. I've never self-published a book. I had published other books before, and obviously those publishers are very different and had no interest to do anything with the history of Lethbridge. So that was my route.
Right.
I looked into it. I made the investment. I self-published it, and that was the best decision I ever made. It
Right.
was, yeah, it was just such a learning curve, but doing it all myself and then being able to focus specifically on the Lethbridge market, which I think I knew a little bit more about than
Mhm.
publishers who are not based there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it worked out very well in that sense.
Is that something you would consider doing again, self-publication, or would you rather
I
avoid the hassle?
I don't think I would.
Mhm.
I think for this book, it was the perfect opportunity because I could approach people. It's a very, very specific market with something else like a novel or like a film history book about a John Wayne movie from the 50s. There's
Yeah.
just no way to reach a wide audience like that. You're not going to make your investment back. You'll
Sure.
get a couple of readers maybe, but as a self-publisher, you just don't have the power to get it into bookstores and in people's attention. So I think the Lethbridge book was definitely an anomaly, and I'm very happy for how it went. But yeah, for another type of book, I don't see it working as well as it did for this one.
I can understand. Yeah. You're very lucky also that the original publisher that you had was willing to just hand over again and say, do
Yeah,
what you will. Right.
yeah,
Usually you
exactly.
hear the opposite. It's like, no, we'll keep it. And like, you'll kind of go through a nightmare of getting the rights back to your book or anything like that. But
Oh,
that's
exactly.
awesome.
It was yes, it was a win-win in many ways. And, in the moment it didn't feel like it. I just thought, all these years and time just wasted,
Yeah.
but obviously not.
Yeah. So getting into the actual content of the book, I'm curious, what were some of the assumptions that you had about Lethbridge, right? And how did these change, if at all, while you were writing it?
Well, yeah, I was one of those believers that Lethbridge didn't have a history, or at least
Mhm.
something worth telling. And very quickly, I was corrected. There's just so much that we're not taught in schools. I think regionally or specifically wherever you're living, you learn the general history, but not the specifics of where you are.
Mhm.
So I had learned a little bit growing up, but the basics. And so getting into how the city actually formed, and it was a mining community, a mining camp, and that really informed it for the first 20, 30 years or so. And
This is in the
then
1880s, you're saying? Or?
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. So about 1881 is when
Yeah.
they actually started setting up the first mining camp, and then
Mhm.
Lethbridge became a recognized community in 1885, and then all the way until 1906 is when it was finally declared a city.
Mhm.
But it's just these little facts, and reading between those lines, well, what brought it from becoming a couple hundred people living in a mining camp to being a city.
Yeah.
And so just reading and digging, I just found myself so intrigued about how that happened. And then probably the biggest hook for me was the events like World War One and the Great Depression. What were people doing at those points in time? And that was something that I really enjoyed sharing because yeah, you sort of know about the events and how they unfold in the grand scheme of things, but just looking at different people's lives and how different businesses sprung up as a result of these massive
Mhm.
worldly events, I think that's what really made this book special for me, and being able to localize and put a face to those rather faceless events instead of just saying prohibition. We can discuss
Right.
a local gangster or something that actually had an effect in Lethbridge history based around that
Yeah.
massive event.
That's one of the things that I really appreciated, especially especially when you're considering how you're writing basically, like you said, a whole history. You're not
Yes.
concentrating on a specific area. And inevitably, when you do write large histories like that, you can, as a writer, fall into the trap of overgeneralizing, right? Or glossing over certain things.
Yes.
But I think that's one of the things that you managed to do very well, is like you took the time to talk about the people who were actually interacting in that moment. And it adds a whole lot of life to what could, in someone else's hands, just be a generic history. But I think that added a perspective that was really quite an excellent choice, I think.
I really appreciate you saying that. That was definitely a difficult decision on how to balance that, because it is a fairly broad history. I mean, I could still be working on and writing the book today and never finish if I was going to include everybody in the history of every building, and you have to pick and choose, but you have to try and be open to some of the things that you might not generally be interested about, or have a connection to, but you still know it's something that's important to other people, or is some kind of historical monument that you gotta explore. And yeah, it was a very difficult balance, but I did work hard on trying to include at least a few names each chapter who were sort of a driving force at that period in time, and try and paint a picture at least what each different era felt like, and what people were doing almost day to day, just to explain and bring people back to that time.
Absolutely. I'm curious. So you've been mentioning, okay, so the prohibition, the mining, and I'm curious, like looking back, right, on this book, and I'm sure you've reread it a million times in the editing process and so on. But looking back on it, where do you see these major points to exist in Lethbridge, these turning points, if you will, right? That could have maybe led to a completely new history if they hadn't happened the way they did. Like, what are the major events that to you stand out in Lethbridge?
Sure. Well, of course, before anything was there, it was called Fort Whoop Up. And so about 1870 is when this was officially established. And throughout that decade, there was a lot of lawless whiskey trading, and that's what really technically put it on the map. But there was a fellow named Nicholas Sharon who came to get a job there, and essentially he got a job as a riverboat captain, or operating a little ferry that went across the river. And then he started to notice that there was coal, and he was the first one to actually start mining for coal. So this was at the end of the 1870s. That was a gigantic turning point. And I think, if it hadn't been him, I'm sure it would be someone else and someone later, but he was the first. And because of that, Alexander Galt, who was way across the country, actually the man who was going to be one of Canada's first prime ministers, he felt he didn't have the experience, and instead he ended up investing in different mining companies, which is what he'd been doing in Nova Scotia. He decided to put his investments there. So I think, that's definitely what kickstarted it all. The year that I sort of define in there as Lethbridge's coming of age is 1912, because it was chosen to be the host city of the International Dry Farming Congress. And that sounds like the most riveting event in history I know. But it was a big deal, because it put Lethbridge on the map. Thousands of people came to attend this worldly conference, and because of it, they paved the streets, they put in streetcars, they made the big premier park still today called Henderson Lake. They put amenities, they put the big grandstand exhibition. So a lot of things that still a lot of Lethbridgians use and have around there happen at that point. So I think that's what really signified that Lethbridge is a place.
Yeah, it's a place also worthy of attention, right? And
worthy of attention, yes. But it also really made the city struggle, because immediately after that, it put them into very heavy debt, because they did all this hard work all at once, and it was a great success, but they had a lot of infrastructure to pay for.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get the First World War, and you get the Spanish flu, and you get Prohibition and the Great Depression. So about 30 years, it becomes a stagnant place that does not grow. So it could have kind of gone either way if they would have, if that event never would have happened. Lethbridge may not have grown as quickly as it did in that time.
Mm-hmm.
Those 30 years of stagnant growth may have been different had they didn't do an event like that and put all of their money into this. So yeah, it's I think that was a very, very pivotal moment. And then obviously the third one I would choose is World War II.
Right.
It ignited the economy. Lethbridge had a lot of training that was happening in the area. And then it had the prisoner of war camp, which was the largest in Canada, and was unfortunately something that really, employed a lot of people, and I think helped Lethbridge's economy and grow it
in like
as
dark
most
ways.
communities grow at that time.
Yeah, it's I again, like a really or at least commendable moment, because you're rather close to the source material, right? As a native of Lethbridge, and I do think it's interesting that you didn't shy away from talking about these more horrible events like the POW camps, or
of course, yeah, there was a big riot in 1907 that was very racially motivated. And yeah, it's not a pretty history. I think most history, when you look at it, is definitely, looking back and seeing how we changed, it always makes you wince. But it's still, Lethbridge was a rough and tumble mining town, so it's not, you're dealing with a lot of crime, a lot of prostitution. It's a pretty ugly, bitter place. And then, yes, when you get to World War I and II, they had prisoner of war camps, and no one really batted an eye. It was like, well,
because that was
has
just
to
the
be
way
done.
it was.
And
Yep, exactly.
yeah, yes, you can't point your finger and say, shame on you, Lethbridge. You just have to present the facts, and of course you don't want to hide the facts either, because it's you might roll your eyes at it, but it's still interesting. It's interesting to know these things.
Absolutely. I'm actually curious, because you mentioned, okay, so 1907, like you're saying, the riots and
yes,
just everything else that you bring up. Did you go into this with the intention of bringing together pieces of information that previously hadn't, or were you actually trying to unearth things that hadn't really come to light before? Like, I don't know how much these riots that you're talking about, for example, are talked about in Lethbridge or addressed at all. So was that a bit of your intention, was to bring to light, or just bring together some stuff that hadn't previously?
It was honestly bringing together everything and telling a cohesive story. Even though I am the occasional journalist, I've never been that person who's like, I'm going to uncover the story, I'm going to get to the bottom of the truth. I am a storyteller, and I think the first and foremost, it has to be interesting and engaging. And I did a lot of research, and a lot of these stories were new to me. And a lot of people who've read the book have said to me that they didn't know about they knew very little about the POW camps, or they knew little bits and pieces, but not all of it. So I think the history was always there, and especially courtesy of the museum, the Galt Museum, and the Historical Society, for keeping all of these records and making it accessible to people. Really, what I did is do all the research, filter out what was the most important, interesting, and paint a picture from the early days to now, just to offer up how the city came to be. It's not a common art form, I would say, in terms of telling history. I think so many people want to get to either the things that we may have not ever heard before, get to that really deep-rooted truth, or go specifically at a very brief but intense moments. And yeah, I'm glad to have offered up a big smorgasbord of Lethbridge.
Absolutely. I actually want to read, if you're okay with that, like a
Yeah.
part, like these, just a few, the opening lines of the first chapter,
Yeah, of
to
course.
lead us into the first, into my next question.
Great.
So, chapter 1, which is entitled First Nations and Fort Whoop-Up, starts like this. While Lethbridge's direct city history began in 1885, the land that it is built upon has had a rather lengthy and intriguing journey. The winding coulee hills, followed by the ever-stretching prairie landscape, were covered in water roughly 70 million years ago by the Bear Paw Sea. Followed was the late Cretaceous period, a time when dinosaurs and marine life flourished over the land we call home today, such as the Elomosaurus. That's a mouthful. A 12-meter snake-like reptile covered in a thick shell. To me, like you were pointing to, this reads very much like a book. Like when I first started reading this, I definitely saw the literary influences in this. And obviously it makes the reading much more engaging in many ways because, as someone who does study history, and I'm sure as well, a lot of history can be very dry to read, which puts you to sleep, even though the history could be very interesting. But I'm actually curious, like, how do you think that writing in this style changes the perception of the history itself? Right. I'm not saying that it's good or bad necessarily, but I'm just wondering, like, how you think that changes the perception.
Yeah, of course. Well, for me, I wrestle a lot about calling myself a historian. I've written a lot of nonfiction books, but I've taken journalism classes and creative writing classes and used that to tell stories. So really, I'm a storyteller, and I'm very interested in history. And I would love to live in so many different time periods as I feel many other people have. And I think writing for me is the closest thing that will ever come to time travel. That's what I get out of it when I do write something creative or something historical is, it allows me to go back to that time and try and, experience it in whatever way I can. And I think that's what I'm trying to do with a lot of my nonfiction writing is just paint that picture. So maybe people could look at the book not quite as like a biopic movie, maybe not all the I stand by all the facts, of course, that are in the book, but I'm trying to do something a little bit more than just use it as a reference guide or use it as this is academic material. I want to give someone experience, and that experience is to go back and feel what it was like in certain periods of time, and so many people who actually were fortunate to live in the 30s or 40s who have read the book really appreciated that fact, and it brought them back, and a lot of people have sent me cards saying, oh, thanks for the trip down memory lane, and other people just have said, oh, I didn't know this is how it was. And I think reaching people on a more, I don't know, entertaining level or some sort of emotional level I think that you gotta give them the dose of the facts in a spoonful of sugar, maybe. I just it's just the way that it comes out, because I'm very intrigued by history and painting that picture. And that's really all I can tell you. That's how it comes out.
That's really good, because you say, oh, well, my field's in journalism, not history, but some of the best history books I've read have been by journalists, right?
Okay.
Just because I feel by the very training that a lot of them get is a more on the ground level, and it weaves they have this ability to weave these narratives together in a way that makes sense, and that puts the reader into the actual action, right, as it's happening. And I think that's something that also appears here. So I wouldn't necessarily say it's a slight against you at all that you have a formation in journalism instead of history. I think that's often
it's a different type of journalism. I forget or a different kind of history. It's
right.
There's a quote out there that journalism is the first rough draft of history, I think.
That's really good. I like that. I've never heard that one.
Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. The quote that I pulled from also indicates something really interesting. So as we've been alluding to throughout this interview, Lethbridge has a rather eclectic history, right? Being a part of Alberta, it's one of the only places in Canada that had dinosaurs for a long time, or that we found like a
Hmm.
lot of dinosaurs. And then you go on to talk about, as you were saying, the First Nations, and then Fort Whoop-Up, and then coal mining and riots, and etc.
Yes.
So it's a very eclectic history. And I'm wondering if you think that informs Lethbridge as it currently stands today, right? Or if it's something that, it's just one more step towards making it what it is. Yeah.
The eclectic history. Well, yeah, of course. I wouldn't say that dinosaurs really shaped who it is right now.
No, of course not.
Yeah, that's little pieces of color, I guess, to give
Mhm.
context is why I did that. But yeah, the mining industry didn't officially close until the 50s. So there's still people around today who, still remember the mines operating and the culture of mining in the hills. And there's still like the tipple, it's called, which is, where they actually would bring all of the coal and disperse it and process it. And
Mhm.
so there's a lot of that industry still there, just still standing. The high level bridge, which is on the cover of the book, that's Lethbridge's most iconic defining image, and that was built over 110 years ago. So
Yeah.
it's still there and in their face. So I think especially that rapid coal industry really sort of shaped the landscape, I would say, as well as agriculture. I mean, that was immediately an area that irrigation was a new thing that was brought by Mormon settlers from Utah who came up and established that and helped push the area as a agricultural, I wouldn't say a wonderland, but a
Haven,
viable
maybe? Yeah.
place.
Yeah. Yeah. Mhm.
Yes. So I think, yeah, a lot of this early history from 120 years ago really is what pushed and launched what it is today,
Right.
because it's still very much an industrial place and an agricultural place. And, it's still, my friend and I remember us conversing while we were in college, and her university instructor said that Lethbridge has no voice, it has no beat or feel. And that criticism didn't sit well with me, and I didn't really understand why. And I think Lethbridge is still kind of finding itself in that terms.
Sure.
Like it
Well, I
it
was going to
was
ask actually,
yeah.
like going off of that, like because Lethbridge itself does seem like a character throughout,
Yeah.
the story, throughout the history that you're weaving, and I guess that's again another literary influence that you're weaving into this. Like,
Yeah, of
just
course.
I was just going to ask that question before you get into it because it's interesting that you bring up the element of voice. Like, how would you describe this character to people?
Yeah,
Like,
it's difficult because it is ever changing, but it was born out of very honest means of hard work and I would even argue poverty.
mhm.
And then it had a troubled childhood. It had a lot of crime and it was not a pretty place. And I think um, in its maybe latter 100 years, I don't know what that stage would be if you looked at it as a character, but
Mhm.
it was a more artistic time of self-reflection and identity, which would be the 1960s, early 70s.
Right.
And now it's in a bit of a different phase. I mean, in the last couple of years, it finally hit 100,000 people. And yeah, I think it's still so young that it's still really finding itself. It's still got its roots and definitely blue collar, um, getting dirty, working with your hands kind of atmosphere, and still is working out a lot of maybe issues that stem from its early days as well. But yes, it's a definite complex character.
Yeah, for sure. So going back to something that you said a bit earlier, of wanting to focus a bit on some of the people that are interacting with one another,
Yeah.
you do specifically allude to some obviously historical agents, right, throughout the text, and you do something very interesting where it's almost you almost adopt a textbook style in a sense, where you put specific information or characters in a box, right? That adds to the main narrative that you're weaving, right? Sometimes these are specific people that you want to highlight. Like I wrote one in particular, Charles McGrath, right? The first mayor, as an example. So why did you, I'm curious, just in terms of the way you framed the book, why did you think it was important to focus on or highlight those moments in particular, right? Rather than just include them in the narrative?
Yeah. Yes. I think a lot of context is key. I think just to do it that way too really broke up the text, because it has photographs, and each chapter has its running narrative or
like through line.
Text. So it really helps differentiate it. But I'm interested in people's lives. I really am. And I think maybe that's a writerly thing inside of me, is I always want to know people's stories from, well, how did you get here? What made you make this decision? Where did that take you? And when you have the luxury of looking back at a full life, well, what did this opportunity afford them, and how did they die? And looking back, what did it all mean for them? So maybe that's a strange hobby or quality to have on my part, but I like to know those things, and I wanted to know that with a lot of these different people. Like my favorite person was Harry Bentley. He felt like Jimmy Stewart would play him in a movie, because he was like a very small town go-getter. He was the mayor for a brief period of time. He owned grocery stores. He sat on every single committee. He
very
built
active.
Built different blocks. He was just a very active, important Lethbridgian, and I don't think anywhere really that his life was ever given much due. Like people know he existed. I think there's a certain block that's named after him. But yeah, I couldn't get enough of reading about someone like that. And I need to share this person's story because they did such an important thing for Lethbridge, and it was because of these choices and what made them them. And I just think it helps give more context to Lethbridge, what types of people and types of lives people were living. And I couldn't get enough of all these different characters and why they chose Lethbridge and why they did what they did.
And thought that it would be worthy of turning into a proper city rather than, as you're saying, just like a whiskey trading post.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. There's quite a few different biographies in here, but they're mostly, in that first half, because it's just people who, chose this burgeoning community and made something of it. And a lot of them were very odd folks. Like there's another guy, his name escapes me right now, but he just kind of showed up on the train one day, and Friedrich Downer. And he started, buying up houses and getting into real estate. But he came from the circus and was just sort of like this weird magical figure who just showed up one day. And like, how do you not tell this person's life?
Right? It's I almost want, I don't know if a biography exists of him. I kind of be curious to see you expand like a lot of these characters into perhaps their own full-length books, because I want to hear about a circus guy who came to the Canadian West. Of course,
exactly.
I want to read about that. Like that sounds really fun.
Yes, and there are so many different characters like that. Like one guy's nickname was the Lethbridge Amusement King, and it's just these little colors that really, I think, paint the picture and it explains to me what kind of city Lethbridge was and what people were filling their time with.
Yeah, and it does also give a snapshot, especially as you're seeing in the 19th century, as Canada is expanding west, for example, much more actively, right, into places like Lethbridge. And it's interesting to see how these completely disparate people can kind of come together and create something really interesting and use the opportunities that, for a variety of reasons emerged in Canada, right?
Yeah.
And of course, as you're saying, some of these opportunities have a dark history behind them, but it's still very interesting to see how this emerged, right? In despite the weirdness of some of the people that you're, or maybe because
Exactly,
of the
but
weirdness of some of the people.
that's always going to be, we'll always have the quote unquote weirdos, the strange people who are
Right.
doing good work or not so good work, but they're part of the city, they're part of the history.
There you go. So you mentioned some events that you thought
Mhm.
were particularly interesting and that you hadn't known much about. If
Yeah.
you had to name one event that you discovered for yourself and you're like, wow, okay, this just completely changes my view of Lethbridge, what would it be?
Hmm. Well, it's for me personally, I would have to say the events of World War II.
Mhm.
But it's not specifically, it's not the prisoner of war camp. It's not the soldiers. What it was how the city came together in that point in time. And for whatever reason, it was just something that inspired me and really painted a picture of the people who were living there. Because,
Right.
you had, and I think it's not specifically a Lethbridge thing. A lot of different smaller communities in Canada and the US were doing these things at the same time, but people
Sure.
were coming together to rally each other and, raise money for the war efforts and sell stamps and war bonds. And, you had certain like meatless Tuesdays. And so the city would have to come together and really, orchestrate this. There was a story in there about there was an announcement of a shortage of beer, and I think they tried to rob a beer truck or
What a
something because they
disaster,
got
right?
yeah they got very panicked over that. But it was also just such a interesting time. Like they had Victory Square, where people, particularly higher ups, like news people or the mayor, would come out and just constantly give briefings on what was happening overseas, and people were just constantly in that little section of the town, just waiting to hear the next thing. And
Yeah.
people were there knitting and crocheting and making whatever they could to send overseas. So it was just I've heard of that, but just to read it and try and portray, at least in the book, that the city sort of stopped and came together in these few years, and that was sort of what people were doing, because you always hear the stories of the actual battles and what's happening in France and Germany and England, but you don't often see or hear what the other people are doing who didn't go to war, who are waiting on the other side for loved ones to come back and
Mhm.
who did their part.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, that's a really insightful answer. I really like that, because often people go for the flashy moments or stuff like
Yeah.
that, but I think that's a really human answer. Yeah, that's really interesting. So coming to the final questions here,
Okay.
the obviously for people who would be interested in this book, which why wouldn't you be? I mean, at this point, like, where I'm curious, like where you see yourself in perhaps the historical or literary tradition in Canada, like insofar as like, are you do you have any particular influences in your writing that perhaps would give people an impression of what kind of writing this is, or not really, you're just doing your own thing, right?
Yeah, that's a tough question. It's there's
I'm
me
here
and
to the
Pierre
hard-hitting
Burton, and that's
questions.
it.
But
Uh,
that's good. Like Pierre Burton is awesome, right?
yeah, I love his work very, very much. I was fortunate to go take a trip up to the Yukon
Mhm.
2 years ago and bought his book about the gold rush, and
Right.
I absolutely loved it. I read that after I had done this book, but I loved that book
Mhm.
because it did really illustrate what it was like, the mad feeling and crazy rush of people just going there. You could really sense the hunger and kind of ludicrous methods that people were taking to get up there. And
Mhm.
I think that's just what I really respond to is when people color history. And so that, when people ask me about my writing, I always say, first and foremost, I'm not a filmmaker. I'm a film buff. Like I
Mhm.
gravitate to movies, and I think movies more than books illustrate what I want to write about and how I write, because it's such a visual medium and kind of interpretive medium as well. So I think I'm coming at more of my writing in a film visual sense, and trying to respond to people's senses and be entertaining and be informative at the same time. So yeah, I haven't read a lot of other books that have done the same thing. I know that yeah, it can get dry, and there's nothing wrong with presenting the facts, but I just much rather tell a story.
No, but I mean, that's a good marketing thing right there. In your next book, Ryan Uytdewilligen, the next Pierre Burton, right?
Yeah.
The new Pierre Burton. There you go. So yeah, that's a really excellent influence, right? And I can definitely see the similarities after reading this book.
Great.
So if you're, I'm actually curious. Are you working on anything on anything else right now that you'd perhaps want to share a little bit with the audience?
Yeah, well, I'm working on always different things. I usually have like fiction and nonfiction and some kind of screenplay going on all at the same time and gravitate. But, the main thing I'm trying to do at the moment is, just save film. I've been writing a lot of articles about movie theaters and the history of movie theaters in Canada in particular, and trying to inspire people to go back to the movies, and classic film I'm hoping to introduce to kids. That's a book that will hopefully be coming into fruition soon. So that's really what I'm working on now. And the Lethbridge history book is such a different thing because I'm from Lethbridge, I'm from Canada, but I don't really write a lot about Canada. That's kind of the specific thing that I have. But my fiction novels are set in the US, and I'm doing a lot of US history. So I would like to do more Canadian history. That's for sure. But it's I don't know. It's
not quite your wheelhouse just yet.
Not quite my wheelhouse just yet. Yeah, I would agree with that. And it's a hard market to break into as well. There's a lot more audience with the States, and I think
that's the history of Canada in a nutshell. Like, it's always better elsewhere.
Yep. Canadians are going to read books about American history, but Americans are not going to read books about Canadian history.
There you go.
Yeah,
unless it's by Pierre Burton.
or something that's even set in Canada, like a fictional thing. So it's something I started with, but hopefully I can interject more and more Canada as I go along.
Yeah, that'd be really awesome. You'll at least have one reader with me. Absolutely. So I'm curious, before one of the last questions I have is, what didn't I ask you? And is there anything? No, but I'm curious because it's always a question that people don't expect. But what would you like to tell audiences as a last?
True. That's the journalism question that we always were told, is like, always end with that one, because everyone is always going to say, no, I have nothing, and then they'll have the best thing to tell you.
There you go.
Yeah, I think you honestly did cover most of what I want to touch on. I mean, there's so many different historical moments that I just am always bursting at the seams to tell people about, like, did you know there was these gangsters in Lethbridge during Prohibition who were smuggling whiskey in eggshells, or
where's the movie about that, honestly?
Right. Yes, I would love to make that movie.
Right.
But yeah, there's so many little nuggets of history that I was able to get in there, and I'm very proud of it and of the reaction. Like, I never dreamed that. I figured I was going to get maybe 100 people to read the book, and most of them my friends and family. And it's just like every day I have sales from people who it's taken on a life through word of mouth, and for people saying, yeah, this is a great gift for my grandfather, or I really just wanted to take a trip down memory lane, and this is exactly what it did. And so that, to me, is the greatest joy, just knowing that people have done that. And people are very eager to share with me family histories too. Most people who do contact me to purchase a book or find out more, they'll come with some sort of background, or like, oh yeah, my great grandfather was one of the people who came in 1885. And wow, I would have never met this person otherwise, and heard that fact. And so I think
I was one of the people who smuggled whiskey into eggshells. Oh, cool.
No one's admitted that yet.
So where can people find your book, actually?
Well, if you're in Lethbridge, there's a bookstore that carries it.
Right.
It's in a few stores in Lethbridge, and most people go to Amazon and then they discover it's not on Amazon because
Right.
I don't want to put it on there at the
I
moment.
understand.
It's if you do want to order a copy, I urge you to go directly through me to support the author, to support me being able to continue to print copies and get more and more actually out there into stores. So if you go to my website, Ryan Uytdewilligen author, that's the best place. You can also follow me, Ryan Uytdewilligen author, on Facebook and contact me that way, and you can order it there. I have autographed all of them, and happily to talk Lethbridge history if you just do want to, come contact me with any question that you might have too.
Awesome. Great. So yeah, on that note, thank you very much for joining me for this. This was highly informative. And honestly, I recommend to anyone who likes our show or who likes, odd Canadian history, like of small villages or towns, to check this book out, right? Because it's right up our listenership's alley. And, it's always good to know more about Canadian history in general. And, as you're saying, support a local or independent author, right? Especially when it's self-published.
Yes, absolutely.
Absolutely. So, Ryan, thank you very much for joining me today.
Likewise, this was a fantastic conversation. You're very insightful and a great interviewer. So I had a lot of fun. And
thank you.
Hope you learned something about Lethbridge.
I most certainly did. All right. See you later.
Thank you very much.